Well, let me tell you about the most expensive mistake I ever made. One decision I made 50 years ago cost me half my eventual wealth. That's not drama or exaggeration. It's simple arithmetic. And I'll share the details later because I think my failure might be more useful to you than my successes. But first, let me tell you why this matters so much if you're over 50. Compounding works in both directions. It magnifies your brilliance, yes, but it also magnifies your stupidity. The difference is that when you're young, you have decades to recover from stupid. When you're older, you don't. By the time you reach 50, most of your big life moves are already set. Your career arc has mostly played out. Your family structure is what it is. Your ability to take wild risks without endangering everything you've built, gone. Unless you enjoy gambling with your retirement, which is about as rational as betting your mortgage at a casino table. The truth is uncomfortable but simple, and I've learned over 99 years that uncomfortable truths are usually the most valuable ones. After 50, you don't need to be brilliant. You need to avoid catastrophe. People love fantasizing about finding the next Amazon or striking gold in cryptocurrency. That's noise dressed up as opportunity. At 50, survival is the real game, and most people don't understand this until it's too late. I grew up during the Great Depression. I was born in 1924, and by the time I was a young boy, the economy had completely collapsed. Banks failed by the thousands. Businesses folded overnight. Families went genuinely hungry. I watched grown men lose their livelihoods in days. I saw families move in together because they couldn't afford separate rent. My own family knew what it meant to stretch every dollar until it screamed. People today think volatility is when the stock market drops 10% in a month. In 1932, the stock market had fallen almost 90% from its peak. That wasn't volatility. That was financial apocalypse. It was grim, brutal, and it left a permanent mark on how I see risk for the rest of my life. But here's what I learned from watching families lose everything. They didn't fail because they lacked intelligence or work ethic. They failed because they borrowed too much, trusted the wrong people, or assumed prosperity would last forever. The pattern repeats itself every generation. The faces change, the names change, the asset bubbles change, but the stupidity, that stays remarkably constant. That's why my number one investment principle for anyone over 50 is deceptively simple. You already had your offensive years, your 20s, your 30s, maybe your early 40s. That's when calculated risk-taking could compound into wealth, because you had decades to recover from mistakes. At 50, time stops being your ally. The clock becomes your enemy. Most people fundamentally misunderstand this shift. They hit midlife and panic about falling behind their peers. So they pile into some hot stock tip or join a GETRICHQUICK scheme. What happens? They go broke faster than they can say retirement crisis. The irony kills me every time I see it. If they'd simply parked their money in boring, reliable, dividend-paying stocks like Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, or Johnson & Johnson, they would have been fine. Not glamorous, not exciting at dinner parties, but fine. And sometimes fine is all you need to reach old age with your dignity intact. Here's what you must understand. The real enemy after 50 isn't underperformance. It's catastrophe. Losing half your money at 60 is not the same as losing half your money at 30. At 30, you have 3 more decades for compounding to rescue you. At 60, you might not even live another 30 years. That's not pessimism. That's arithmetic. You have to shift your entire psychology from trying to be clever to trying not to be stupid. Let me illustrate with someone I knew personally. Brilliant man, Ivy League education, successful law career spanning decades. At 55, he decided he was falling behind his wealthier peers. The comparison was eating him alive. So he dumped a substantial fortune into dot-com startups in the late 1990 seconds. Everyone was getting rich. He couldn't stand being left behind. By 2002, he had less than half his original capital. He spent the rest of his life talking about what he almost had. A complete waste of brains and money. The tragedy: if he had just held boring dividend-paying stocks, he would have been financially comfortable for the rest of his days. His ego couldn't tolerate boring. His retirement couldn't tolerate his ego. That's the pattern I've watched destroy portfolios for 7 decades. So if you're over 50, forget chasing unicorns. Forget trying to be the smartest person in the room. The smartest person in the room is usually broke, divorced, or both. Your goal now is durability, staying power, having enough capital to outlive your own mistakes. I've always said, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. For investing after 50, all you need to know is what will wipe you out, and then never go there. That means avoiding 3 specific things. First, avoid leverage. Debt is poison when you don't have decades to repay it. I watched people in the 1,930 seconds borrow against their homes, thinking they were perfectly safe. When the crash came, they lost everything. The house, the savings, the future. That image burned into my brain permanently. Warren and I built Berkshire without leaning on borrowed money. We could have juiced short-term returns with leverage, sure, but 1 or 2 wrong bets with debt, and we'd have been broke like everyone else. Staying solvent was infinitely more important than looking clever to Wall Street. Second, avoid speculation. You're not going to outtrade the 25-year-old with 6 screens and no mortgage. And here's a secret, neither is he in the long run. Day trading is a game where the house always wins eventually. I once watched a successful Los Angeles lawyer, sharp guy, excellent income, decide he was also an expert on currency trading. He read some articles, formed confident opinions, and bet heavily against the Japanese yen. It wiped out most of his retirement savings, not because currency markets are inherently unpredictable. That's obvious. But because he was wildly overconfident in his ability to predict them. The tragic irony: if he'd simply admitted, I don't know anything about currencies, and left his money in boring index funds, he would have been completely fine. Third, avoid complexity. The more complicated the investment structure, the higher the probability that you're the sucker in the deal. If you can't explain the investment to your spouse in 60 seconds, you probably shouldn't own it. At 50 or even 55, your best strategy is keeping things crushingly boring. Boring works. Boring compounds quietly. Boring lets you sleep at night without checking your portfolio at 3 a.m. The financial world doesn't reward excitement. It punishes it with ruthless efficiency. Here's something that sounds backward but is absolutely true. The less thrilling your investments are after 50, the more likely you'll actually enjoy a thrilling retirement. Don't aim to get rich quick. Aim not to die poor. That's the whole game. Now let me talk about envy. Because envy has ruined more portfolios than recessions ever did. People don't go broke because they can't earn money. They go broke because they can't stand watching someone else earn more. I've called envy the stupidest of the 7 deadly sins. And I meant every word. Why? Because it's the only sin where you don't even get any pleasure. Greed, at least you enjoy spending. Gluttony, you enjoy eating. Lust, well, there's some temporary satisfaction involved. But envy, you just sit there marinating in resentment while the other person enjoys their success. You get absolutely nothing out of it except misery. Envy is also contagious and destructive in ways people don't anticipate. If your neighbor buys a luxury car, suddenly your perfectly functional car looks inadequate. If your brother-in-law brags about a 10-bagger stock, suddenly your stable 8% annual return looks like failure. That's when rational people make catastrophically stupid decisions. Let me give you a real example from my own experience. In the 1,990 seconds, Warren and I owned boring businesses, insurance companies, a candy shop, furniture stores, newspapers, nothing remotely glamorous. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs half our age were making billions out of thin air. Zero revenue, maximum hype. We looked like dinosaurs until the bubble burst in 2000. The same people who laughed at our slow and steady approach were suddenly broke. We were still compounding. Being rational and patient looked stupid right until it looked brilliant. Here's the lesson. The game isn't about beating others. It's about not losing yourself. I once knew a man who invested reasonably well for years. Steady returns, growing savings. Nothing spectacular, but solid. Then his golf buddies got rich, trading oil stocks. He couldn't stand being the small-timer in the clubhouse, so he leveraged up and chased the same trades. When oil collapsed, his portfolio collapsed with it. His buddies lost money too, but they still had careers generating income. He was staring at retirement with half his nest egg gone forever. At 50 or older, envy becomes lethal. You don't have time to rebuild from your own stupidity. One envious decision can erase 20 years of patient accumulation. The best investors I've ever known had almost zero concern for what others were doing. They didn't care if their neighbor bragged about cryptocurrency gains. They didn't care if CNBC shouted about disruption every hour. They cared about staying solvent and compounding quietly over decades. That's it. That's the whole strategy. Here's the supreme irony about envy. If you want a genuinely happy old age, you should actively root for your friends to succeed. Celebrate their wins. Mean it. Envy makes you miserable every time someone else does well. What a terrible way to live. Imagine being 80 years old and still bitter that someone else had a bigger house in 2025. What an absolute waste of a human life. I've outlived plenty of people who were richer than me at various points in time, but I never envied them because I could see most of them were playing games they couldn't win long term. Sure enough, they burned out. Their money evaporated. Some of them drank themselves to death. Meanwhile, I stayed boring, rational, and breathing. That counts for something. Your retirement doesn't care if someone else made more money. Your family doesn't care. The grocery store doesn't care about your relative performance. Only your ego cares. And your ego has bankrupted more investors than any bear market in history. Now let me talk about my own mistakes, because they're more useful to you than my successes. Everyone loves hearing about winners. Almost nobody studies the losers. But that's where the real lessons hide. Here's one of mine. Decades ago, I bought into a company without truly understanding its long-term durability. On paper, it looked cheap. The numbers were clean. Management seemed competent. But I didn't think deeply enough about whether the business model would last. The result? I made a quick profit and sold too soon. If I'd had the discipline and insight to hold that position, it could have doubled my eventual net worth. That's not hyperbole. That's compound interest doing what it does when you let great businesses run. Compounding doesn't forgive early exits. It punishes them permanently. The mistake wasn't the original investment. The mistake was me. I lacked the discipline to stick with a truly great business. I settled for being right in the short term instead of being rich in the long term. Most investors make the same error. They sell winners too soon and cling to losers too long. It's completely backward. You should do the opposite. But human nature pulls you the wrong way with magnetic force. People crave certainty. When something goes up 30%, they want to lock in gains. It feels safe. It feels prudent. But selling Coca-Cola after a modest rise in the 1,970 seconds wasn't safe. It was foolish. That stock kept compounding for decades. Anyone who sold early was congratulating themselves while quietly robbing their future self blind. I don't torture myself with regret anymore. Regret is wasted emotional energy. But I do use that memory to reinforce one simple rule. If you find a truly great business, sit on your ass and hold it. Don't get clever. Don't get itchy fingers. The world constantly tempts you to do something. Turn on the news and you'll see endless reasons to act. Elections, wars, inflation, recessions, panics, manias. But most of that is noise that doesn't affect great businesses over the long term. Good businesses survive market chaos. Great businesses actually thrive during it. Your job isn't to outguess every headline or predict every twist. Your job is to avoid selling the goose that lays golden eggs. I see this pattern constantly. Someone holds a reliable dividend-paying stock for 20 years. Then they read some newsletter about disruption and decide to rotate into growth. They dump Johnson & Johnson to chase a tech IPO. A few years later, they're wondering why their income dried up and their account is bleeding. The mistake isn't failing to predict the future. Nobody can do that. The mistake is abandoning what works in pursuit of what excites you. Excitement is a terrible investment philosophy. Let me tell you something about overconfidence. Most people are far too certain of themselves, and markets punish that arrogance sooner or later. I've watched this pattern repeat for nearly a century. In the 1,930 seconds, people were absolutely certain prosperity would never return. They hoarded cash and completely missed the recovery. In the 1,960 seconds, everyone was sure America's big companies would compound at high rates forever. They ignored valuations and got crushed in the 1,970 seconds stagflation. In the late 1,990 seconds, investors thought technology stocks only went up. We all know how that delusion ended. Confidence feels wonderful, but it's not correlated with accuracy. In fact, I've observed the opposite pattern. The people who sound most certain are usually the ones who lose the most money. Here's reality. The world is too complex for you to know everything. You don't get rich by being a know-it-all. You get rich by knowing what you don't know and rigorously avoiding it. When Warren and I built Berkshire, we passed on thousands of investment opportunities. We didn't understand them, so we ignored them completely. And guess what? We didn't miss much that mattered. Baseball throws you plenty of pitches. You don't have to swing at every one. But most investors can't resist swinging. They think having an opinion on everything makes them look smart. They'll tell you where oil prices are going, what interest rates will be next year, how some startup will revolutionize everything. What they won't tell you, 90% of those opinions will be wrong. Here's what I strongly recommend. Develop the courage to say, I don't know. It's a rare and incredibly valuable character trait. If you can admit genuine ignorance, you won't bet money on nonsense. You'll stick to areas where you actually have competence. That's exactly what we did at Berkshire. We understood insurance businesses. We understood Coca-Cola's competitive moat. We understood See's Candy's pricing power and customer loyalty. So we bought them and held them. We didn't understand airlines or dot-com business models. So we left them completely alone. That single habit, admitting ignorance, saved us from disaster more times than I can count. Overconfidence kills more investors than recessions ever will. It's not the market that ruins you. It's your illusion of knowing more than you actually do. So the next time you feel the itch to predict the unpredictable, stop and ask yourself, what if I just don't know? That simple question might save your entire retirement. Let me talk about something most people never understand. The difference between thinking like an employee versus thinking like an owner. It has nothing to do with job titles or income levels. It's pure mindset. Most people, even extremely intelligent ones, spend their entire lives playing career games. They optimize for promotions, titles, corner offices, and perks. They spend years trying to impress bosses they don't even respect. They polish resumes instead of building actual wealth. That's careerism. And it's an elaborate trap. I've said many times, the world isn't driven by greed, it's driven by envy. Careerism feeds directly on that. You watch the person next to you get a fancier title, and suddenly you want one too. But here's what nobody tells you. Titles don't compound. They don't pay dividends. Ownership does. When Warren and I built Berkshire, we didn't care about looking important or impressive. We cared about owning things that made money while we slept. Seas, candies, Coca-Cola, insurance companies. They didn't care whether we had vice president titles. They just sent us checks every quarter. Meanwhile, I watched brilliant lawyers, investment bankers, and executives waste decades climbing corporate ladders. They earned high incomes, but owned nothing that worked for them independently. The minute they stopped showing up to the office, the money stopped too. That's not wealth. That's just a high-class treadmill with better suits. If you're over 50, this lesson matters more than almost anything else. You don't have infinite time left to keep trading hours for dollars. Eventually, your energy runs out. Your health deteriorates. The treadmill stops whether you like it or not. So ask yourself honestly, do you own anything that works for you when you're not working? Real estate that generates rental income, stocks that pay reliable dividends, a business stake that keeps earning whether you show up or not. If the answer is no, you're not really investing. You're just extending your career under a different name. Stop caring about titles and what colleagues think. Stop trying to impress people at parties. Start caring exclusively about ownership. That doesn't mean quitting your job tomorrow like some reckless fool. It means systematically redirecting your energy and capital into assets that will outlast you. Buy boring, durable businesses through index funds or individual stocks. Live well below your means. Build ownership stakes instead of wasting money trying to look successful to people who don't actually care about you. It's a much quieter game. Nobody applauds when you buy shares of Procter & Gamble. There's no social validation, no ego boost. But in 20 years, those shares will still be paying you dividends when all the career applause has long faded into silence. Careerism fades. Ownership compounds. Choose the one that will still matter when you're 70 and can't work anymore. If I had to reduce my so-called success to just 3 habits, it would be this. I avoided debt, I avoided drama, and I avoided stupid people. That's it. No magic formulas, no secret algorithms, just disciplined subtraction. Let me explain each one. First, DEBT. I've said this 1,000 times, but it bears repeating. Debt destroys discipline, magnifies every mistake, and guarantees that when bad times inevitably come, you are the first to get wiped out. If you're over 50, debt is absolutely lethal. At 30, maybe you can recover from a leverage mistake. At 60, it's game over. You won't live long enough for compounding to save you from that hole. Second, drama. I systematically avoided unnecessary fights, pointless feuds, toxic relationships, and people who seemed addicted to chaos. Drama wastes enormous energy that could be spent thinking clearly, building patiently, or simply enjoying life. Plenty of financially smart men have been utterly ruined, not by bad investments, but by bad divorces, bad business partnerships, or bad tempers. You can be brilliant at finance and still bankrupt yourself with personal chaos. I wasn't interested in that path. Third, stupid people. And by stupid, I don't just mean low IQ. I mean people who are reckless, dishonest, unreliable, or addicted to shortcuts and scams. They're radioactive. Their stupidity spreads like disease. Hang around them long enough, and you will get caught in their inevitable fallout. Early in my career, I watched colleagues fall in with slick operators who promised outsized returns with minimal risk. The pattern was always identical. Fast talk, shady deals, inevitable collapse. The smart colleagues ended up dragged down simply by association and proximity. So I made it an iron rule. Better to have fewer friends and partners, but extremely high-quality ones. My partnership with Warren worked beautifully for over 50 years. Not because we never disagreed, we disagreed plenty, but because we shared identical core principles. Rationality, patience, honesty, no drama, no debt, no tolerance for stupidity. That shared foundation made us incredibly durable. Here's something most people absolutely don't want to hear, but it's true. Getting rich after 50 is far less about making brilliant moves and much more about avoiding fatal ones. At that age, survival becomes the strategy. You can still build significant wealth after 50. I've seen plenty of people do it successfully, but they didn't do it by chasing hot tips or day trading like 25-year-olds with nothing to lose. They did it by being boring, steady, and relentlessly rational for decades. The surprising truth is this: you don't need to double your money overnight to win. You just need to not blow yourself up. Let me give you a concrete example. I knew a doctor with a good income and sensible spending habits. At 55, he started systematically funneling his savings into a diversified basket of high-quality dividend-paying stocks. Nothing fancy, nothing exciting. He completely ignored market noise, religiously reinvested dividends, lived well below his means. By 70, he wasn't spectacularly rich, but he was genuinely financially free. No debt whatsoever. Plenty of passive income. Comfortable and secure. Now compare that to another man I knew, sharp entrepreneur who thought he was behind his peers financially. At 52, he dumped his entire savings into speculative real estate deals, leveraged to the absolute hilt. When the market turned, he was completely bankrupt by 57, had to start over from zero. The difference between these two men wasn't intelligence or work ethic, it was pure discipline. The non-negotiable rules. If you want to get rich, or simply stay rich after 50, here are the non-negotiable rules. First, keep everything simple. Own businesses or assets you actually understand at a fundamental level. If you can't explain the business model to your spouse in 60 seconds, you probably shouldn't own it. Second, preserve capital above everything else. Every dollar you lose at 60 is infinitely more expensive than every dollar you lose at 30. You don't have multiple decades to recover from catastrophic mistakes anymore. Third, systematically avoid envy. Don't look at the guy who doubled his money in some risky cryptocurrency bet and feel inadequate. Most of the time he won't keep those gains anyway. Your job is not to keep up with anyone. Your job is to stay financially standing when others fall. Fourth, play pure defense. A steady 7% compounded over 15 years is an absolute miracle at age 50. It doubles your money, then doubles again. By the time you reach retirement, you'll look genuinely rich to anyone who spent those same years chasing exciting fads that evaporated. Most people over 50 completely forget this fundamental truth. You don't have to be spectacular. You just have to stay solvent and patient. The world has a mysterious way of rewarding the people who simply endure while others destroy themselves. Here's the paradox nobody wants to accept. At 50, you don't need brilliance to win the game. You just need to stop doing stupid things. And believe me, the world offers you an endless, unlimited buffet of stupid things to choose from. Crypto scams, day trading fads, exotic real estate schemes, private equity deals you don't understand. The list never ends and keeps getting refreshed with new packaging. If you want one brutally blunt truth to end on, here it is. If you're not spending less than you earn, nobody on earth can help you. Not me. Nor Warren, neither the smartest financial advisor on the planet. The laws of arithmetic don't care about your feelings, your lifestyle preferences, or your elaborate excuses. If more money flows out than flows in, the end result is mathematically guaranteed. You go broke. Simple as that. I've watched people earning six-figure incomes live like paupers in old age because they couldn't resist spending everything they made plus some. And I've watched modest earners die comfortable and dignified because they lived simply and invested the difference consistently for decades. It's not about intelligence or lucky opportunities. It's entirely about behavior and self-control. Overspending is the single fastest way to ruin any investment plan, regardless of your age. If you keep digging the hole deeper every month, compounding works viciously against you instead of for you. People ask me constantly, Charlie, what's the best investment strategy for my age? My answer is usually the same. Stop buying expensive garbage you don't actually need. That advice alone would solve half the financial misery in the entire world. The truth is, when you plan your intention to become a billionaire like me or Warren, I just avoided stupidity consistently for long enough that compounding did the heavy mathematical lifting. I simply didn't shoot myself in the foot. That's the entire game when you're older. So if you're over 50 and genuinely worried it's too late, stop panicking immediately. You don't need to reinvent yourself or discover the next big technological breakthrough. You don't need to become someone you're not. You need three things: patience, simplicity, and durability. It's not glamorous advice that sounds good at cocktail parties, but it's the only advice that actually works in reality. If you can manage these basics, avoid debt, avoid envy, avoid overconfidence, think like an owner, stay boring, and spend less than you earn, you'll be fine. Not a billionaire necessarily, but fine. And fine is a beautiful outcome when you're looking at the years ahead. Here's my final question for you to think about seriously. When you're 70 years old, do you want to be envying your neighbor's expensive toys and vacations? Or do you want to be genuinely enjoying your own financial freedom and independence? The choice is philosophically obvious. The execution is tragically rare. Most people choose wrong without even realizing they're choosing. Don't be most people. Remember this above everything else. The world doesn't reward brilliance nearly as much as it rewards simply avoiding stupidity. And nothing is more comprehensively stupid than spending yourself into misery and dependence. The math is unforgiving. Time is not on your side anymore. But discipline is always available to anyone willing to use it. Go make good choices. Your future self will thank you. See you for next video.